What's up, man?
I think everybody's here already. If you'll open your hymn books to number 531. 531. We'll sing the first, second, and last stanza. 531. Does Jesus care when my heart is painted deeply for mirth or song? As the burdens press and the cares distress and the way grows weary and long? Oh yes, He cares, I know He cares. His heart is touched with my grief. When the days are weary, the long nights dreary, I know my Savior cares. Does Jesus care when the way is dark with a nameless dread and fear? As the daylight fades into deep night shades, does He care enough to be near? Oh yes, He cares, I know He cares. His heart is touched with my grief. When the days are weary, the long nights dreary, I know my Savior cares. Does Jesus care when I say goodbye to the dearest on earth to me, and my sad heart aches till it dearly breaks? Is all to Him does He speak? Oh yes, He cares, I know He cares. His heart is touched with my grief. When the days are weary, the long nights dreary, I know my Savior cares. Number 357. 357. Y'all bear with me, I'm having trouble reading, so, and I don't want to get the wrong verse. 357. Oh, that's not it. I'm so sorry. Higher ground. What page is higher ground on? Anybody right quick?
$375.
375. Thank you very much. I had the right numbers in the wrong order. I'm pressing on the upward way, new heights I'm gaining every day, and praying as I onward bound, Lord, plant my feet on high that I have found. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. I want to live and love the world, though Satan's darts at me are hurled. For faith has taught the joyful sound, the song of saints on higher ground. Lord, lift me up and let me stand by faith on heaven's faithful land, of higher plane than I have found. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. Before I sit down, set your books on 890. This will be the invitation song after the class today. This time, I'm going to ask Brother Chris if he'll lead us in the word of prayer before we go to class.
Now, please. Dear Lord, thank you for allowing us to come here tonight to learn your word. Thank you for allowing us to all make it here safely. Be with all those that are sick and need your prayers. Be with us as we go throughout this lesson, that we may learn according to your will. In your Son's name, amen.
All right. A little bit of review as we get back into the context of where we're going to be. We're in the book of Galatians. What's distinctive about this particular letter over the other letters by Paul? What makes this one different? It's about his apostleship, but he defends that in other places. He's had to. But there's something particular to the recipients of the letter.
They were removed.
They were removed. They moved away from the gospel. But you know, Corinth did that.
It's the multiple churches.
The multiple churches. Most of the letters that Paul writes are going to be to one particular congregation of people, one assembly of people. Galatians is written to a region. So what I want to do, just as we're getting back into it, I don't know, who's a visual learner? Most everybody is. Or at least, not everybody, I guess, but a lot of people. I am. Have you ever had, those of you who raise your hands who are visual learners, have you ever had someone try to tell you a story or relate something to you about either a place, a picture, or a person, and you had no idea what they look like? And you know how your face just kind of just glosses over? And so what do? You just kind of smile and nod, and oh, that's nice, and then you go away, you totally forget. I'm like that. So what I want to do is, and hopefully this will work, it was working before, good deal. Okay, this is the Roman Empire as of the first century. And so when you think of where is Galatia today? What would Galatia be known as today? Turkey. It's modern day Turkey. Now, unfortunately, this particular map doesn't have the borders of the different regions. What you're seeing here, the purple, is the empire at the death of Augustus in AD 14. The green is what the empire conquered after his death. But Galatia is this region right here, and it would go all the way up here, come down, and you kind of have a little spoon here that goes up and around. A very huge area. Piece of trivia. What did the Greeks call the Gauls? Anybody know? Any history people?
Barbarians.
Well, yeah, they were barbarians with the language. They called them the Celts, the Celts. So you hear the word Celtics, the Gauls, just different terminology for the same origin of people. So what ended up with Galatia? Galatia was named after the Gauls. They came up and they decided about 300 BC that they were going to start moving their empire. They're seeing all the world change completely. And there was a little bit of upheaval after the death of Alexander, and so they decided, well, we're just going to go down south. And so they started making their way down south, and the idea was they're going to take some of Alexander's holdings. Greece beat them, and beat them badly. So instead of coming down here, they went over here, and they conquered this region here. And then around the mid-200s, the Romans are really flexing their muscle. They take them over. They were nice enough to leave their government intact, but that lasted until about 40 BC or so, when Rome said, enough of you, we're going to go in there. But this region is known as Galatia, because of the Gauls, named for the Gauls, and it's this region right in here. Now, there's a little bit of controversy as to what part of the region Paul is writing to. And when I say a little bit of controversy, it's an old controversy that's pretty much been settled. The only ones who take the opposing side are the Germans, imagine that. The Germans, the German theologians, the German philosophers. And the fight was this letter to northern Galatia up here, or southern Galatia down here? Now, when you look at the missionary journeys of Paul, we're looking at the first missionary journey. Let me zoom in here. Okay. These are the cities in southern Galatia that are mentioned in the book of Acts, and this is part of his route in the first missionary journey. You never see any of these northern cities mentioned in the book of Acts. And that's the major reason why it's pretty much a settled thing, except for the outlying German theologians who say that this book, this letter, was written to these congregations that he established during his first missionary journey, and to whom he went back and visited in his second missionary journey. And you see very, very familiar names: Antioch of Pisidia, Iconium, Derbe, Lystra. All of these right in here. That's the people he's writing to. Now, the Gauls' reputation. What kind of reputation as far as their culturally? Were they a people who were just, they would find something and hold on to it, or were they always looking for something new? Always looking for something new. And so this is a situation that the letter finds itself in, or the Galatian brethren find themselves in. Who came behind Paul? Who was following Paul through his missionary journeys, constantly trying to undermine him?
Jews.
The Jews, the Judaizing teachers. These Jewish Christians. But the Jews, these Jewish Christians, they still, were the Jews and Gentiles, did they get along? They didn't. How did the Jews feel about the Gentiles in general? They were unworthy, they were dogs. Someone even said trash, and that's 100% right. They were outsiders, they were heathens. In the South, we throw that word heathen around. They were heathens. And they didn't. And guess what? When these Jewish people became Christians, and all of a sudden the Gentiles started becoming Christians, what did they do to Peter in Acts 11? You remember after Cornelius and his family in Acts 10, Peter comes back to Jerusalem, and what does he have to do?
Why did you eat Cornelius with Cornelius?
Yeah, what's the deal, Peter? I mean, they bow up to him. That's great. So Peter has to say, hey, wait a minute. God told me to do this. And then he tells them about the vision. He tells them everything. And it's not just Peter's word, but the witnesses that Peter took with him, that were with them, saw everything happening. And then what was the final thing? Oh, okay. But they still didn't see the Gentiles as equals. In fact, they saw them as subservient to them. Not subservient isn't really the real word. They weren't truly God's people. They were just kind of God's people. and a portion of the Jews' minds. So, they start following Paul. They hear about Paul and what he's doing. They start following him. And this is what's happened in this region of Galatia. They've gone from congregation to congregation in these cities. And they're saying two things. And it's the two main themes of the book of Galatians. What are they? Circumcision. And what else? If they're going to undermine the message of Paul, what else do they have to undermine? His apostleship. So there's two things that Paul has to do right at the very beginning of the letter. And in the very first verse, we see him do that. He is establishing that he is an apostle. Made an apostle by whom? Jesus. Not by man. Not from man, not out of man, but by Jesus. He is a called apostle. I like the way he uses that in Corinthians and Romans. I am a called apostle. That isn't just what he did. It wasn't his occupation. It's who he is. He is an apostle. And so in the first part, after we get out of the greeting, he says, I marvel you're so soon removed. Why is he marveling? Here's this message that is different, that is added to. Here's the gospel message, and they have placed all of these Pharisaical traditions on top of it, making it harder for the Gentiles to be a Christian than God made it to be. And the biggest push was that of what? Biggest push. The one part of the Jewish tradition that they're pushing onto the Gentiles. Someone said it before. Circumcision. Snip, snip, snip. They want them to be circumcised. Now, Paul's having to reestablish the gospel message, but before he can reestablish the gospel message, he's got to reestablish his authority as an apostle. And so he tells them, he tells them twice here, even if an angel teaches you another gospel, you're not to listen to him. Let him be accursed. Let him be anathema. As we said before, so say we again. And the idea is not that he's just saying it twice in the letter for emphasis, but he's saying, hey, we told you this when we were with you. But now we're telling you again. And so he's really, really stressing this point. And then, as we get back into the text, we kind of set the situation. And as we get back into the text, in verse 10, he asks a rhetorical question. For do I now persuade men or God? Do I now persuade men or God? The word persuade there, we made mention of this last week, to please. Am I trying to please men or am I trying to please God? And of course, this is a rhetorical question, and what's the answer to it? It's trying to please God. We've got to ask ourselves this question. What are we doing in life? Are we just trying to constantly please the world and culture around us, or are we living our lives to please God? Paul's mindset was, I don't care what the culture says. I don't care what the world says. I care about who says. What God says. And so do I seek to persuade or to please men or God? Or do I seek to please men? And here's the thing. If I still please men. Now listen to how Paul says that. If I still please men. There was a time in Paul's life where that's exactly what he was trying to do. And who was he trying to please?
Jews.
He was trying to please that Pharisaical sect to whom he belonged. Did that sect preach the law of Moses, or did they preach their own traditions? Their own traditions. The law became secondary in their minds. What they said, what they wanted the people to do, that is what it was important, not what God wanted them to do. And Paul went around not trying to please God by preaching the law. He went around forcing the traditions of the Pharisees onto the people. That was his focus. And he admits it here. He admits it here. If I still pleased men, I would not be a servant of Christ. If I still live that way of life, is it possible to be a servant, subservient to the world, and at the same time be pleasing to God? It's an either-or proposition, isn't it? The most miserable people you'll ever meet in regards to Christianity are those who are trying to have one foot in the world, one foot in the church. It never works. It will make your life miserable. Paul says you can't have it both ways. Jesus said you can't have it both ways. You cannot please men and God at the same time. You've got to choose who you're going to serve. Because when you split your loyalties, it's just going to end in misery. Paul understood this. Paul understood this. And so he is stressing to them here, you get back to the message that we taught you. Get back to the gospel message that saves. Now, as we get into this next section in verses 11 to 17, we're going to see Paul begin to reestablish his apostleship. And as he does this, he's going to show to them, especially at the end of the chapter, in that last paragraph from 18 to 24, from whom he actually got his message. He's going to show them, this is not a message I got from man. This is a message that came by revelation, inspiration, directly from God. Yes?
I really thought about it, what you just said. Paul, man, he believed what he'd been taught, even though he could have read for himself like we can to try to learn better.
Sure.
He did what he was taught.
Sure.
He was following strictly what he did.
Absolutely. He was following just, he was, what's the word I'm looking for? Goose stepping. He was goose stepping based on what he had been taught all of his life. And you know what? We can't get onto him too much, because you know what? We do the same. If we're not careful, we'll do the same. We'll do the same. Richard?
There's one other thing too, though. He didn't receive it from man, he received it through revelation.
That's it.
Jesus, that's put in his head.
That's right.
And it's hard for him to get that out.
That's exactly right. And he's going to have to prove this to the Galatians before he can establish his message. He's got to reestablish his authority. He has been completely undermined by these Judaizing teachers. And so he is going to reestablish his authority and show how he gained his apostleship in the first place. And then he's going to go back and show how the message came from revelation and from whom he got the revelation. Now, this is going to take us back to Paul's conversion. And it gives us more detail about what events transpired after Paul was converted than what the book of Acts gives us. And so we need to go back to about Acts 7. And we need to start thinking, what happens in Acts 7? It's a really pivotal moment. It's a long chapter, and it consists mainly of one sermon / speech given by a particular man. Stephen. Who is Stephen? How do we know Stephen?
First martyr.
The first martyr. And at the end, here he is. He is murdered there on the streets by this crowd who is just enraged. And who is standing there? The first mention of him. Saul. And what's he doing? Holding the coats. What does that tell you about what's going on? Not only he thought he was okay, he was behind it. And I think there's a reason for that we'll get into a little bit later. Let's turn over there and let's kind of see some of the events, and then we'll get into our text as we just kind of set up this background and remind ourselves of some of the things that have transpired. At that point in time, Stephen is killed. Now, There's some history that goes behind it. We've talked about before. We're not going to get way too deep into the swamp of history in here. I know sometimes that can get a little bit, you know. Why were the Jews so bold to kill Stephen when they had no right to put anybody to death? They had to beg Pilate to kill Jesus. Why?
Wasn't he gone? Was there a point in time where Pilate was gone?
Pilate's gone. There's no Roman authority in Judea at this time. What happens behind the scenes? Pilate sends some of his troops to the north to put out a rebellion. They go outside his district in order to do so. The governor of that district is really, really upset. And so he tattletales to Tiberius, and Tiberius says, Pilate, come see me. He gets called to the principal's office. Takes him 2 years to get there. In that time, there's nobody in Jerusalem looking over this period. And you know what happens? Acts 7, Acts 8, and Acts 9, where the Jews hit the church, taking the opportunity of this lack of oversight, and it hit the church hard to the point where they scatter the Christians out and push them out of the region of Judea. When Pilate gets to Rome, Tiberius is dead. Who can guess who's in charge? You'll know this name, and he doesn't have a good reputation. Caligula. Caligula's in charge. And Caligula's too busy having his little parties, quote unquote, to really care about any business under Tiberius. So he banishes Pilate. Pilate commits suicide. And then he establishes a new authority in Judea. But that takes time. And during that time, the Sanhedrin goes wild. And so Stephen is killed in Acts 7. Saul's standing there holding the coats. And Saul is not just complacent, more than likely the idea that he's holding the coats, that he's behind this mob who does this. The church is scattered in Acts 8. And in Acts 9, where is Saul going? To Damascus, way up north. Sanhedrin doesn't have any authority in Damascus, but he has letters of authority, a permission going up there. And who's he looking for? He's looking for Christians, members of the Way, as they were known at that time. Members of the Way. He was looking for Christians to bring them back and set them before the Sanhedrin. And we know from Paul's own words in Acts 21, Acts 26, that when the Sanhedrin sent it around, said thumbs up, he lives, thumbs down, he dies, he always voted with that black marble, that he blackballed him, always voted for death. So, that's the situation. And what happens in Acts 9 as he's traveling?
He meets Jesus.
He meets Jesus. That blinding light, middle of the day. This blinding light blinds him. And what does Jesus say to him?
Why are you kicking against the door?
Why are you persecuting me? Why are you kicking against the goads or against the pricks, the King James says? What does that mean?
Well, I never really thought about it, but I often wondered if maybe he in the back of his mind, then he wasn't doing something right. You know, I mean, I don't know, I always wondered about that.
Maybe. In Acts chapter 8, as the church is scattered, you see Philip going into Samaria. He meets the Ethiopian eunuch. How does he know to go to the Ethiopian eunuch? He was told to by the Holy Spirit. How does Ananias know to go to Paul? He's told to go. There are, in that time, this age of miracles, there were occasions where the Holy Spirit told the preacher to go preach to someone specific. Have you ever wondered why Philip was told to go preach to the Ethiopian eunuch? Have you ever thought about that? He was headed back home, wasn't he?
Spread the gospel.
Spread the gospel. he's going to take the gospel message south. And here's a man who was a physician. He was the treasurer, the accountant, if you will, of Candace. That was the name of the Ethiopian queens. Candace, the pharaohs in Egypt. Candace is an Ethiopian. He worked directly. He was part of the royal house. And he takes the message there. And he was told to go. Here's a man of influence. And the gospel can spread. Now, that statement, why are you kicking against the prick? I have never thought too much about that. And I don't know, you may have kind of read over that. The statement itself gives a picture of the time when cattle was used to work the fields, and when they wouldn't want to go because, you know what, those big fat animals, they sometimes just don't like to go, and they're out there and they're working on those fields, and so they would have those sticks behind it, and they were placed and so you would move, and it would hit them in the backside, and they would kick, but they were positioned to where they couldn't kick them off. And so it's either keep getting poked or you go. And so eventually, even the most stubborn of animals are going to do what? They're going to go. Jesus uses this image in this statement. And it could mean several things. It could mean on the surface, in Matthew 16:18, after Peter gives the great confession of Christ, the Son of the living God, what does he tell Peter? I'm going to give you the keys of the kingdom. But before that, he says, blessed art you, Peter, son of Jonah, Bar-Jonah. For flesh and blood has not shown these things to you, but my Father which is in heaven, I say unto you, thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my what? Church. And what's the next phrase? And the gates of Hades, literally. I know the older translations like to translate the word Hades to hell as inaccurate. And the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. Not even my death. Not even the unseen spiritual realm. Not even my death. And soon after that, from that moment, he starts preparing them for what's going to happen at Calvary. Now, it could be Jesus is saying this to Paul, going, you can't stop it, Paul. It's going to happen. And you're fighting against me to try to stop it. You're not going to stop it. So quit kicking against me. That's a possibility. I think there's another possibility that's more likely, however. How many times did Jesus refer to the Jews and how they treated the prophets? What did Israel almost always do to the prophets that would come with a message for the kings? They were persecuting them, killing them many times. When he's looking over Jerusalem, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who killed the prophets. Could it be that individuals, and again, this is me supposing a little bit here. Can't really be dogmatic about this.
Could you not say that he was telling Paul, you're not going to win this. You might as well give this up.
That's a possibility. But could it be possible that individuals had been sent just like Philip was sent to the eunuch? Could it be possible that Stephen was one who was sent to Paul and Paul had him killed? Could it be possible that multiple individuals were sent to Paul and Paul had him killed? And so now finally Jesus goes to Paul directly.
It makes you wonder, why did Jesus pick Paul? I suppose because of his knowledge, of the old law. He knew that backwards and forward. And then his zeal, he looked in the future, and he was a perfect man at the perfect time.
It's hard.
To take, he wrote how much of the Bible?
He wrote the majority of the New Testament. Jack.
His heart was in it too. He wasn't doing it. He was doing it for God. He was going.
Jack.
Paul is fighting God.
And that's
This is God's will, Paul. And you're fighting against it, and God's will is always done. What you're doing is futile. You're kicking against the goads. This is God's will. Like you said, it's going to happen no matter what you do, and you can be part of it.
And that's the crux of it. The question that's interesting to me is, what's the goad? What keeps pricking Paul that he's kicking against? And could it be also that this reputation that Paul has is why Ananias says, whoa, wait a minute. Are you sure? And he says, yeah, go. And now Paul is humble. Because now Paul has a faith that trusts in what he saw and what was said, the message. He's penitent because what's he doing when Ananias finds him? He's grieving, isn't he? He's grieving over his past. I've been wrong this entire time, and look at what I've done.
He thought what he was doing was right.
He did.
He was doing it all.
He did. He even says in later on in the book of Acts, I've lived unashamed about what I've done up until this day, up until that day. And so this is where we find Paul, and this is where he picks up in Galatians 1. And so he goes back there. Am I pleasing men or pleasing God? Am I still pleasing men or still pleasing God? Look at verse 11. Let's read down to verse 17. But I make known to you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former conduct, way of life, in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. And I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my fathers. But when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me through his grace to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went to Arabia and returned again to Damascus. Now, notice what he's doing here. He's already said in verse 1, my apostleship, I am an apostle, not from men nor through men. Men didn't give me the position. And the argument against Paul's apostleship was, well, Paul's not really one of the original 12. So even if he is considered an apostle, he's a sub-apostle. He doesn't have the same authority as they do. And because he didn't have the same authority, you know what? He probably got some of this message wrong. And so let's tell you how it really is. And this is probably how it went. And so Paul's having to reestablish his apostleship. Where did my apostleship come from? And so he says, I make known to you. I make known to you. Literally, I'm certifying to you. We talk about the notary. You get something notarized. I'm having this certified. This is a certified document. It's true. I make known to you that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man, literally after man. This is not something that comes from a human mind. It didn't originate in the mind of man. And it wasn't made known to me by man. Now, he's referring specifically to a group of men. The argument, he's a sub-apostle. He's a sub-apostle. He's not one of the original 12. He's a sub. And he tells them, and he's going to show them, the message that I'm preaching to you, I didn't learn from the apostles. Who did he learn it from? Jesus. How? Divine revelation. Inspiration. This is an inspired apostle. An inspired apostle. And so the message isn't according to man. It's not from man. And he says, for I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it. Someone didn't sit me down and teach me this message. True or false? Is Christianity a taught religion? True. How do you know what to do to be saved? Someone teaches you. Someone teaches you. The Great Commission. What's at the heart of the Great Commission? Teach. Teach, teach, teach. You go out and you disciple people. And you do it how? By teaching them. You teach them. And here Paul is saying, I wasn't taught this. This message was given to me not by man, and I wasn't taught this. But it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ. The word revelation, it's the word where we get our word apocalypse, apocalypseos. It means an unveiling, an uncovering. Jesus uncovered the message for Paul and gave it to him. Literally. Now you sit back and you just think about that for a minute. That's kind of one of these wow. Now you think about, here's a man who had so much passion and zeal. And when he found out he was wrong and that passion and zeal was misplaced, he immediately had an about face. The book of Acts tells us he went from that moment on preaching and teaching. And we're going to find out here where he went. But here's a man who, when found that his zeal was misplaced, he put it on the right path immediately. And with that same passion and that same zeal, if not greater than what he had, he went to spread the message, a message that he received directly from Jesus, revealed to him by Jesus. This is an announcement from God that he received, which would be beyond any human knowledge or human reach. And so in verses 11 and 12, he gives us the source of his message right away. The source of my message is divine. Absolute divine. It didn't come learning it in school. It didn't come from study of anything or sitting down and conversing with individuals. It came directly from Jesus Christ. Revealed. The gospel was revealed. Christ was the revealer. Now here's what he's going to do. He's going to use himself as an example of the power of the gospel. This was not done unless there was something backing it up. You didn't use yourself as an example when you tried to persuade. In the schools of philosophy of the day, philosophy was huge at this time. You didn't use yourself as an example unless you could back it up. It was seen as arrogant. But Paul does, because Paul could back it up. And so he's going to use himself beginning in verse 13. He says, "For you have heard of my former conduct in Judaism." Okay, here's how I was, guys. You know how I was, because my reputation preceded me. And what does he mean by conduct? King James says conversation. What's he talking about there?
Manner of living.
It's the manner of life. It's the way I live my life. You know how I lived my life when I was back working with the Jews. You know how I conducted myself. You know how I lived my life. How'd you do it? Persecuted the church. How I persecuted the church of God. And he says, beyond measure. Beyond measure, and tried to destroy it. Beyond measure, literally beyond excess. In other words, you think as far as you can go, the most extreme thing you can do, and you go a couple of steps more. That's where I was in persecuting the church. That was my manner of life. That was the way that's what I lived for. We have things we live for, don't we? What do we live for? Family. Why do we do what we do? We all have purposes in life. We all have things and goals that we're trying to reach. Paul's goal, utterly destroy the church. That's what he lived for. That's what consumed him. Because he wanted to destroy it. He wanted to destroy it. So he persecuted in order to destroy, literally to lay waste. You've seen the news footage, no doubt, of the forest fires in California, out west. The devastation looks like a wasteland, doesn't it? That's the idea. Paul wanted the church to be nothing but a wasteland. utterly destroyed, just blown off the face of the earth. He wanted it to be just scorched earth. Why? What was his purpose? He was defending his religion in doing so. Defending his religion, specifically the traditions of the Pharisees. So in verse 14, he says, "And I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation." He was successful. He was successful in what he was doing. Commonplace when you go and look at the way the education. Oh, I'm out of time. Richard, remember when I said I was going to stop early? It's not going to happen. In the first century, when you're looking at training, education, you know, the book of Proverbs says, iron sharpens iron. And it's something we've lost in our education system today. But there was competition among students back in the day. This is what Paul's referring to here. He surpassed my contemporaries. Those that were that I was on the same level with, I quickly surpassed them. I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation. I left them in the dust. I was head and shoulders above them all. And he says, being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my fathers. And here was his zeal. What was fueling him? What was the gas that he kept putting onto the fire that was inside his heart? He loved his religion, which was the traditions of the Pharisees. Notice he didn't say, because I love that law of Moses. He admits it here. I love the traditions of the Pharisees. I love my religion, and that gave me the zeal to move past all of my contemporaries, to leave them all behind. But here's the pivot. When it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me through his grace. What does he mean by that? How did God separate him from his mother's womb? On the surface, it would seem like, okay, well, when I was born, this is what happened. But this is very, very similar language that we see in some of the Old Testament prophets. Jeremiah says this about himself. Isaiah says this about himself. It's said about John the Baptizer. And here is this idea of being designated or set apart. And the set apart isn't referring to the physical separation from the womb, but the separation that this individual had because of God's purpose for him. Now, did Paul have a choice in the matter? Absolutely he did. This is the perfect example of where God's will and man's choice go hand in hand and what can happen when that occurs. It took a miraculous intervention, but Paul finally changed his mind and he succumbed. He finally decided to follow what God's will for him was. The word separated is a word, usually when you think separated, set apart, it's a word more that means designated. It's literally placing a border around. God had placed a border around Paul for this purpose. This is what he intended for Paul to do. But Paul had to make a choice. Paul ultimately had to submit his will for God's will. And this is the perfect example of that. And so here again, proof that Paul's apostleship wasn't from man. The 12 didn't say, hey, let's make Paul an apostle and he can work for us in the Gentile world. No. This was God's purpose, Paul says. He's establishing his apostleship very quickly. To reveal his Son to me, verse 16, that I might preach him among the Gentiles. That was the will. That's what he wanted. I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood. Where is he claiming his gospel message came from? Revelation from Jesus. And so now he's saying here, I didn't talk with humanity. I didn't sit down with humanity immediately. What did he do? Nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were the apostles. I didn't meet the apostles yet. But I went to Arabia and then returned again to Damascus. In verse 18, we find out this was about a 3-year period. When we're talking about time and the Jewish way of time, the way they counted time, a portion of the year in their mindset was a complete year. So, a literal 3 periods of 365 days, probably not. But it covered a 3-year span. In other words, it touched 3 years. He was in Arabia, then Damascus, and then coming down to Jerusalem. And we don't have time to get into the rest of the chapter. We'll cover this last part and get into his defense of the gospel message next week. But the whole point here, and what we need to take away, is not just that Paul was an apostle from God, but notice what he says in verse 10. In fact, if we get nothing else out of this chapter, think about that question in verse 10. Do I seek to please men, or do I seek to please God? Because the answer to that question is going to determine our fate for eternity. If we go around and we're trying to please the world and act like the world, look like the world, and talk like the world, we're not going to be successful spiritually. But if we're striving to please God, if we're striving with a zeal on fire for what God has to say over what man has to say, that's how we're successful, spiritually speaking. It's then, living a life trying to please God, then we'll hear those words, well done. And there's one here tonight who needs to obey that gospel message. We're going to give you the opportunity right now to do that. Hearing, believing, repenting, confessing, and being immersed. Maybe there's one here tonight who realizes, my zeal isn't like Paul's. I'm lacking in that. I'm lacking in my desire to please God, and I need help with that. I want my brothers and sisters to pray for me, go to God on my behalf. We're wanting to do that right now. As together we stand and sing.
Careless soul, why will you linger, wandering from the fold of God? Hear you not the invitation? Oh, repent to meet my God. Careless soul, oh, keep the warning, for your life will soon be gone. Oh, how sad to face the judgment. I'm prepared to meet thy God. If you spurn the invitation, till the Spirit shall depart, then you'll see your sad condition, unprepared to meet thy God. Careless soul, oh, heed the warning, for your life will soon be gone. Oh, how sad to face the judgment. I'm everybody an opportunity to, if they had anything to bring up in announcements, you can do that now. Anything at all? Anybody? Okay. I'm gonna have my eyes looked at again tomorrow. I hope I get some kind of conclusion of what's gonna happen. I don't know, but I appreciate the prayers for that. Is there anybody else? Brother Don, will you lead us in closing prayer?
Dear Father, we thank you for this opportunity to come together tonight to study another portion of your word. We are thankful for the lesson presented, the life of Paul as he worked from the Galatians, and his commitment to spread the gospel. We pray for Richard in his sort of his eyesight, and he can get a good report. We also pray for the troubled places in the world, Lord. The people in California, and the fires, and the storms in the Northeast, and the devastation that's occurred in Haiti. All these things are disasters, Lord, and we pray that your hand will ease their pain, bring about the normal. We also pray that we use our life in your service, and we reach out to others, and they may see you in our lives, be drawn to you. We thank you for Jesus that came to this earth and lived and died for our sins. Forgive us now as we depart. We expect the next one time, so prayer in Christ's name.